I got asked, what is FlipFarm in a nutshell? And I said, it's just making oyster farming more fun. I enjoy oyster farming, but sometimes it's not as fun as it could be. But yeah, FlipFarm makes it more fun. That's a key for us.
Welcome to OYSTER-ology, a podcast about oysters, aquaculture, and everything from spat to shuck. I'm your host and the food walker, Kevin Cox. If you've ever stood on an oyster farm and watched rows of floating baskets rise and fall with the tide, you might not think of it as a place where major technological breakthroughs happen. And you'd be wrong, because what's emerging from an oyster farm in Marlboro Sounds, New Zealand is nothing short of revolutionary. My guest today is Aaron Pinnell, an oyster farmer and modern aquaculture pioneer whose creation of FlipFarm represents a quantum shift in how oyster farming gets done. Based in Marlboro Sounds, New Zealand, alongside his wife and business partner, Debbie Pannell, Aaron transformed years of hands-on farming experience at Marlboro Oysters into a global innovation that's changed how oysters can be grown and handled worldwide. Several months ago, I had the chance to visit Aaron on his Marlboro Oysters company, FlipFarm, in the spectacularly beautiful Marlboro Sounds on the top end of New Zealand's South Island. It was there that I saw firsthand how the FlipFarm innovation is used to flip, desecrate, sort, maintain, and manage oysters effortlessly. I immediately recognized it as simple, scalable, and transformative, and able to reduce losses, to improve quality, to work more safely, and to scale a farmer's oyster production exponentially. But what struck me most wasn't just the incredible engineering. It was the elegance of the idea and the simplicity of the design, which made me scratch my head and wonder, why didn't we think of this sooner? And today, Aaron's here to tell us all about it. So flip your thinking of how aquaculture is supposed to work as we hear about when oyster farming stops requiring brute force, harnessing chaos storms and fouling into a system, what scaling really means, how oysters push back when you get it wrong, improving work-life balance, turning bottlenecks into systems, innovation by necessity, and how a dog and a busted handbrake changed not just one person's life, but the entire oyster world. With farmer, inventor, business person, and architect of modern oyster farming, Aaron Pinnell. Aaron Pinnell, welcome to OYSTER-ology. Man, I cannot tell you how excited I have been to get this interview with you. I had the great pleasure earlier this year of meeting you in person in Marlboro Sounds on the northern tip of the South Island in New Zealand. And you took me out on your boat and showed me your Marlboro oyster operation. And it rocked my world, I have to say. I've never seen anything like it before, and it really changed the way I look at the future of oyster aquaculture and production. So welcome. It's so great to have you.
Oh, thanks, Kevin. It's great to be on here as well. It's good to hear a Kiwi accent. I've been listening to a lot of your podcasts over the last few months, and we'll get a Kiwi accent on there for now.
That's right. We definitely need one. We're lacking in that department, and there's no better person I can think for that than you. So again, thanks for being here. Before we get into FlipFarm, I want to hear a little bit about your background, your story, and the creation of Marlboro Oysters and how you got into this whole oyster world.
Yeah, well, I guess the story how I got into aquaculture is a funny story, actually. I grew up on sheep farms in New Zealand, and then when I left school, I got into dairy farming. So cows were kind of more interesting than sheep, and I did that for quite a few years. Really enjoyed it, learned a lot of skills, but the price of land was skyrocketing at the time, and I guess I got a bit disillusioned with the chances of owning my own farm. And so decided to look for something else and kind of went into a few lost years, I guess you could say. My parents and I had a sea kayaking company, which we do during the summer, but I kind of had odd jobs, and I had this beat up old car with a dodgy handbrake, and I'd parked it at my parents' house, who live on a small hill, and I had a dog in the car, and I'd gone inside to get something, and came out, and the dog must have bumped the stick shift, which I needed to use to hold the handbrake, and the car rolled down the hill and across the road and knocked over the entire 100-foot fence of my neighbour, which was extremely embarrassing. So I was very apologetic. I said, look, I need to come and help you fix the fence. And of course, I had no money to help to pay for it. So I said, look, I'll donate my labor to fix your fence. And he was very good about it. He said, no, look, it's fine. The fence was obviously rotten. It was due to fall over. So anyway, I spent a weekend helping him fix the fence. And at the end of it, he said, oh, what are you doing at the moment? I said, oh, I'm just kind of doing odd jobs. And he said, do you want a job? And I said, well, what doing? And he said, oh, working on my mussel harvester. And I thought, okay, it sounds interesting. And, I've always had a passion for agriculture and growing things, but also a huge passion for the sea. I loved everything about the sea, fishing, diving, boating. So to get to go and work on a boat and be paid for it, harvesting mussels sounded perfect. So that was my introduction into aquaculture, and in a little town called Havelock in the top of the South Island. The Marlboro region is kind of the home of aquaculture in New Zealand. And the biggest industry there is the greenshore mussel industry. And that's what I worked in for the next 20 years. So I started off working on boats and got my skipper's or captain's license and ended up skippering vessels for quite a few years, and then gravitated up into management, as you tend to do once you've been in the industry for a while. And I found a real niche in R&D and research. And I always joked that I went to university. It was a lovely day, but I decided it wasn't for me. So I did the visit and then went farming instead. So I didn't have, a science degree. I didn't have a science background, but I really loved the whole concept of research. And so I guess the advantage I brought to that is my practical knowledge after 15 to 20 years of farming on the water. So I had a great job actually working quite a large mussel company and pretty free license to look at different growing systems, different species. And one of those species I was working on was oysters, Pacific oysters. So we were growing oysters with a few different systems that we were trialing. And we partnered with a large firm up in the North Island, right up in the top of New Zealand, that was the largest oyster company in New Zealand. And it was going reasonably well. And then in 2010, the industry got struck by an oyster virus, often referred to as the Pacific Oyster Mortality Syndrome, or POMS. And that is a disease that's affected a lot of the world's oyster growing areas. And it finally came to New Zealand in 2010, and it decimated the industry at that time. And the main thing it did is took out all the wild catch, if you like. So the New Zealand industry at that time was largely a stick industry. So they would catch the wild spat on bundles of sticks. These are kind of 4-foot long sticks, and they'd be nailed out, spaced out on racks in the intertidal area. And then you just basically wait for the oysters to grow, and then you take them off the sticks and you part them. So that industry was severely affected, mainly because they couldn't catch the wild spat anymore. And so at that time, the company that I was working for was bought out by another large company, and they were exiting the oyster industry. So they didn't really have a lot of interest in continuing the oyster research I was doing. And we saw an opportunity to use some of the technology that I developed at that time to grow juvenile oysters to resupply this industry that had been devastated. So, that was kind of our introduction to the oyster industry. Along the way, of course, I met my wife, Debbie, and that's a whole nother story. So we made that decision to leave a very stable corporate job and launch ourselves into the world of oyster farming in the face of an impending oyster virus.
So you and Debbie started Marlboro Oysters together.
That's right, yeah. So in 2011, we started that company, and it was largely growing juvenile oysters up to about a 2-inch size and using hatchery spat, which at that point had been commercialized, and then sending those juvenile oysters up to restock the farms, which to then carry on and be finished off for export.
So you weren't actually growing the oysters for sale as a finished edible product yourselves. You were actually growing them to supply other oyster farms because of the POMS decimation?
That's right, yeah. So the POMS tends to affect young oysters, and sort of oysters under 2-inch are probably the most, and it tends to also affect them over the summer months. So once the water temperatures kind of get above around sort of 60, 65 degrees, that's when the virus has its largest effect. So we would take in a hatchery spat, a T8 or 8 millimeter size hatchery spat, we used a floating bag system. So basically a soft mesh bag with foam floats and clips that clipped onto lines. And then we would introduce those in the spring and then grow them through the summer and then send them up in the autumn once the winter had cooled in the North Island for finishing. Because in the area that we were at, we didn't currently have that virus in the area. So it allowed us to farm there and then send the stock up.
It's interesting. So it sounds like in New Zealand, because of in 2010, this palms devastation, it kind of caused the oyster industry in New Zealand to shift from wild spat on stick collection into what is now kind of considered modern day aquaculture.
Yeah, it definitely did. The difficulty during that time was that there was very limited spat supply from hatcheries or nurseries in New Zealand. So large companies that could build a hatchery or build a nursery were able to take advantage of it. But a lot of the industry was kind of stuck in a bit of a poverty trap where they weren't getting enough for their oysters. And that meant that they couldn't spend the millions of dollars required to build the nurseries and hatcheries. So there was a limited amount of companies that could do that. And so for the rest of the industry, they just had to keep going as best they could. And many sadly did leave the industry during that time.
Right. So Debbie came from it sounds like a very different background than you. She was in the corporate world in
optometry.
So here you are, you're operating this farm, you're providing oysters for other farms. At what point in time did you decide maybe we should just do this for ourselves and actually sell finished oysters ourselves? Or did you ever actually do that before FlipFarm came along?
We did it at a very small scale. So really just supplying a couple of local restaurants. But we wanted to choose a site when we first started that was definitely clear of the virus. That was our biggest fear. We'd seen what happened to the rest of the industry and we were kind of terrified of that happening to us as well. And of course, leaving a very comfortable corporate position and taking on a lot of debt, we were very cautious to make sure that we had a reasonable chance of success. And so the area we'd chosen was free of the virus, but wasn't a great area for finishing oysters. It could grow okay, but it didn't tend to condition as well as what the farms did up in the North Island and the shallow estuarine areas. So this suited us quite well for growing oysters to juvenile stage, but we had to work really hard to get the consistent quality that's required to go to restaurants. So we were supplying a couple of restaurants. We'd stock our bags very low, 30, 40 oysters in a bag to get the consistency. And it wasn't really until FlipFarm came along and we were still supplying these restaurants and they were starting to say, wow, these oysters are looking much better. They're really consistent and the meat quality's much better and we're getting good shelf life. And that started to make us think that, well, maybe we could actually change that model and go all the way to market.
How did you find the location that Marlboro Sounds is now? Is it just the one location that you took me to, or do you have other farm sites as well?
Yeah, the one we visit is actually our new farm. So we have another site on the western side of the Marlboro Sounds, and that was our original site in a place called Cressel's Harbour, or also known as Squally Cove, and it's very well named. So that was where we started off, and we've decided that having all our eggs in one basket in that cove is kind of risky. So we've started another operation in the Pelorus Sound, which is where most of the greenshell mussel industry is.
And for those who haven't had the incredible opportunity to see this area, this is not just your typical pristine water location for oysters. This Pelorus Sound area where you have the new farm is so pristine, so wild, and so seemingly untouched. And then when you consider what you're doing there, it's absolutely remarkable. How did you develop the idea of changing your technology into what ultimately has evolved into FlipFarm?
Yeah, so we'd scaled the company very quickly. The oysters that we were sending up north were going really well. The system was working that we had. The oysters were able to be grown through in less than a year in the North Island, and the quality was good. The survival was much better, and the demand for those oysters was very strong. So we'd gone from kind of starting off with 2 or 3 million oysters in the first year up to, I think we peaked at about 20 million oysters in 2015. And then things kind of went a little bit awry. So 2016, we had a lot of problems. So for a start, the system that we're using, although it is a good system in the right location, in the environment that we were in, where we get very strong winds and at times some reasonably rough conditions, it was just wearing the gear out way too fast. So we had 2 people full-time just repairing gear. We had about 13 in our team altogether. Because we were doing largely the young oysters, that's where most of the work is. So we were having to grade regularly, and that meant handling the gear a lot. So that every time we had to sort or grade, all the gear had to be removed off the line, taken to our floating grading shed, which was a bit of a luxury that we had there, and then emptied out, put through the grader, restocked into fresh bags back to the farm. So a lot of work every day.
And this was equipment that you had purchased in the marketplace. This isn't anything that you had developed yourself at that point, right?
No, that's right. This was an existing system that we'd used. It's commonly referred to as a floating bag system. And that's a system that is used around the world, but we'd sourced it from Australia. Yeah. So we had a very high labor requirement, and it tended to be a lot of kind of young, fit guys that we needed to be able to handle these bags every day. And then a few other things happened that year. The oyster virus finally found us, so we had quite significant mortality. And then we had a predatory flatworm, which came in, and that did quite a bit of damage as well. We lost probably 20 or 30% just due to that flatworm. And it would particularly affect the oysters that had been weakened by the oyster virus. So we might not actually have a full mortality from the virus, but they would be very sluggish. And therefore, this flatworm, this wafer worm, could get into the shells, and it's an aggressive predator of oysters.
Wow.
So we had about 40 to 50% mortality in our oysters. We tried lots of different ways to get around this, and we'd bought some equipment from a small farmer locally, and in that equipment, they had just about a half a dozen hexal baskets. And the hexal basket is a rigid plastic basket that's commonly used in Australia and around the world. But it wasn't a basket that we were using at the time, so I'd kind of discarded them into the corner of our yard and not thought too much about it. And then I was wandering around one day looking for some equipment. I had this concept in my head that we could leave the equipment on the line, because all the problems seemed to happen when we're having to remove the equipment on and off the farm. So I was trying to come up with a system that we could leave the equipment there and empty it on the line. And so I found these rigid baskets, and I thought, well, this could actually work quite well, because we can open the doors so we can empty them out. And initially I was looking at ways of a clip, still using a clip on the basket, but I just couldn't get anything that would actually last well enough. And so one day, out of sheer frustration, I just threaded the line right through the middle of the basket. So we had a float on one side, because obviously we're in deep water, so all the gear had to have floats on. And then I threaded it right through the basket and thought, right, it can't come off now. There's no way. I thought, it's not really practical, but at least I'm not going to lose the basket. And as I was manipulating the line, I noticed that all the baskets flipped around and sat on the floats. And that was kind of, I guess, the Eureka moment where I thought, well, this is something we can use. We can potentially automate this. So, I guess that was the first indication that we were onto something, and we went from there.
So your setup at the time was long lines in deep water. What kind of depths are we talking about for this sort of arrangement?
So our shallowest farms are probably about 20 feet, and then our deepest it goes right up to 120 feet. In some areas of the Sounds.
How did you take it from that sort of Eureka moment, like you described, into creating something that you could really experiment with and develop into what you have today?
From the threading the line through the basket, obviously that wasn't going to be a long-term solution. So then came kind of bits of pipe and zip ties and the usual R&D efforts that go on. And I'd got it to a point where I had, maybe 100 baskets out using a system like that, and I could start to see it working. And then I had a visit from Gary Seidel from Hexal in Australia, who was the inventor of the Hexal basket we were using. He happened to be over for a conference and found out that we'd bought some of his baskets and was quite fascinated to see how we're using them. So he came out for a look at the farm. And at that point in time, all we were looking at is to come up with a system to help us farm oysters better and solve a lot of our problems. And the number one problem was the losing the equipment off the farm. That was the main issue. And he took one look at it and said, this is going to be huge. He said, if you can develop this, I've got 20 farmers right now that would buy this. And I was kind of, really? Yeah, okay. I hadn't even thought about that as a business. We were very focused on our oyster operation, and it was a reasonable scale operation. So we were kind of happy with that. So then came what I refer to as the pestering stage. And that was where Gary would call me every 2 months and go, is it ready yet? Is it ready yet? Is it ready yet? Which was kind of good because we were very distracted with our oyster business. And it's a really good example of what can happen in oyster farming. We were so stressed and busy and head down that the research kind of came a second place. We didn't know it was going to save us time at that point because we hadn't developed any of the automation, but we could see that it was going to save us potentially losing the gear off the lines, which was really important for us. And so, I guess at that point we started to look at this as well. Maybe we should actually develop it. And so we started to put a bit more effort into it. And we started to learn about injection molding and plastics and what have you. And then I'd said to the guys, look, this is going to be slower. We're going to have to empty the equipment on the farm and then take it to the grader and to the sorter. But they were okay with that because at least we weren't picking gear up off the beaches, which was pretty depressing. Yeah. And then we started to tinker around with some of the machinery, and I had a really good relationship with a local engineer who had run a large firm, but he kind of semi-retired, and he literally worked out of a workshop in his backyard, but he was a very good design engineer. And he and I kind of bounced ideas together over a few months and started coming up with some of the machinery. And as we started to use this on the farm, we started to realize that this is not just a little bit faster, it's a lot faster, and it's a lot easier. And that was kind of a second Eureka moment where we realized that the automation was going to actually become almost the most important part. And so that really got the momentum going at that point. And that's where we started to put a lot more gear in the water and develop the system further.
So describe the FlipFarm system to me. I want our listeners to visualize this thing because it really is quite a sight to behold.
Yeah. So basically we have the rigid hexel basket. And on top of that, we attach a float. That's usually a blow molded float. And then on the bottom side, we attach what we call an axle. And we call it an axle because it's basically a tube that a rope passes through. A 1-inch rope can pass through this tube, and it allows the basket to rotate at a 90-degree angle to the line. So you end up with a string of these baskets at 90 degrees to the main backbone. And each of those baskets can individually rotate on this axle. Now that allows us to flip the baskets over onto the float, which elevates the basket and the oysters out of the water and allows the air drying, which is obviously really critical for a whole lot of things, but primarily fouling control. But it also allows us to rotate the basket into a position where we can open the lid and fill it vertically, or you can open the door and rotate the basket further and the oysters just fall out with gravity. And then we use an elevator, which brings them up onto the boat. So it means that you can semi-automate the process of filling and emptying and also the fouling control. And we've developed machinery that basically just floats alongside the boat and the boat ties up to it. And that machinery passes underneath the line, lifting the baskets up to a nice working height, and then allows you to do those operations.
What I found so amazing about it was that in addition to coming up with a more efficient way to grow the oysters and protect your gear, to develop this, you also had to develop machinery that could then work with those modified basket arrangements. So you've got this little skid that kind of floats alongside with two pontoons, and there's kind of a ramp in the middle of the pontoons that causes the baskets to flip. Tell me a little about that, and how did you develop those extra pieces of machinery?
Yeah, so we call that the helicat because the part that flips the baskets is a helix, and then it's a little catamaran, so it's kind of a shortened version. And we tried a few different ways to flip in the early days, and they were kind of working, but they weren't quite as effective as we'd hoped. And I'd always had an idea of this kind of plowshare type arrangement that could rotate the baskets steadily over. So I discussed it with our engineer and he drew it up and I looked impressive on the CAD. So I said, right, let's build one and try it out. So he did, and we took it out to the farm and we mounted it on the side of the boat. And we had a breakdown or something that day. And I said to our farm manager, look, just go and give it a try on that line. It may or may not work, but just try it out. I'll go to fix this motor or whatever had broken down. Anyway, 5 minutes later, he came back and I said, it didn't work. He goes, no, I flipped the line. And he'd flipped it and he was back in 5 minutes.
The whole line.
The whole line. And I said, well, that's fantastic. I said, I better come and film it. So I grabbed the camera and I said, go do another one. So he flipped the second line. And that was the first video we put on YouTube. And that video is still on there of the second ever line we flipped with that helix. And of course, he was pretty upset that we'd left that old video on there because he kind of ran over the line and, did. And I said, no, it's great. It just shows that, you can run over baskets. It's not going to hurt them, that it's one of the best bit of equipment we've ever designed that works straight off the bat. And then we have, the other little platforms that we have the emptying and filling gear mounted on.
The emptying, filling piece of it I found equally fascinating also. But first, I think you need to describe the line. So tell me a little bit of how long your lines are and how many baskets are on the lines and more or less how close they are to one another.
Right. So you can pretty much have any length of line for FlipFarm. It's just that the shorter lines become slightly less efficient to work because with the flipping, for example, it takes you longer to get on and off the line or maneuver the boat between the lines than it does to flip the line. Mm-hmm. So if you're flipping tens of thousands of baskets a day and you've got lots and lots of short lines, then it's just slightly less efficient, but it still works fine. As far as the maximum length, it just comes down to what gets awkward to handle. But I think our longest line, we have 750 baskets on. Our shorter lines are around 250. So that's a good range. And then the spacing of the lines depends a little bit on the length of the lines. So they obviously swing in the current and the wind. So for the shorter lines, we might be down to 20, 25 feet apart. And then some of the longer lines might be more like 30 feet. And then one other thing we've started to do is actually put two lines onto one anchor. And we use about an 8-foot spreader post at each end. And so you can go down one side and then back up the other, and that's actually working quite well.
So basically you get to the end of the line, do a U-turn, and go back down the other side of it for the other line there.
Yeah, that's right. One of the reasons for that is that a lot of our permits in New Zealand, we have a limitation on how many lines we can put on the farm. And that's really a throwback to the mussel industry. Most of the farms we're using in Marlboro were mussel farms. And so to change that permit and add extra lines is more difficult than just doubling the lines up.
Okay, so let's go back to the loading and unloading and tell me a little bit about that because the efficiencies in that I thought were remarkable as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because the flipping is what gets a lot of the attention because it's fascinating to watch. And I often talk about a bottling line. So if you were filling bottles, previously what we were doing is filling a bottle with, say, a jug, one at a time. And now what we're doing is filling multiple or flipping multiple at once. So it makes it much more efficient. But really what I enjoy using most is actually the emptying and filling gear because that's where all the time was taken up previously, standing at a hopper, opening bags, tipping them out, stacking them up. That was the real back-breaking part of the job. And so now to be able to just stand and open the doors on the baskets at a nice waist height and then gravity basically does the rest, it's virtually effortless. So what's gone from an extremely physical job where you're reaching and unclipping bags and stacking them onto a boat and then returning them back onto the lines is basically turned it into if you can stand on a boat and you enjoy working outdoors, then you can operate the system. So it allows a much wider demographic of staff to work on the farm now.
You had even designed it so that you could fill or empty 2 or 3 baskets at the same time.
Yeah, so when we're filling, we sort our oysters and we do all our counting and decide how many oysters we want to put into each basket at the sorter. And then we put 3 times as much into each crate at that point. And then when we tip that crate, we tip it into a funnel that has a 3-way chute. So it drops into 3 baskets at once. And as you tip that crate, it splits it evenly into each of those 3 baskets. So every tip is filling 3 baskets. So it means that we can basically, with a crew of 3 or 4 on the boat, we can fill as fast as you can open or close the doors. So it's very quick.
So it sounds like everything is pretty much self-contained on the water, from the helicat to flip them and then to raise them up onto the barge and empty or fill the baskets. And do you sort and count them on the barge that filler is attached to?
There's lots of different ways you can do the sorting, and there's pros and cons with each different setup. So we have a floating grading shed. So it's basically a big float with a shed on it. And we have our grader in there on one of our operations. And so we're just transporting the oysters to and from that floating platform. That works very well. And then in our new operation, we actually have the sorter mounted on a barge that's motorized. So we can actually empty the oysters directly off the line into an elevator that carries them up and grades them straight through that sorter. And then from there, it sorts 4 ways. And then we do all our counts and pre-fill our crates. They get stacked onto a small boat alongside the larger vessel. And then that small boat takes them back and deploys them back into the baskets. So that makes it a very efficient method of sorting on the water. But obviously that's quite a big setup. So it's something that's more for either a larger company or a consortium of companies to look at.
So when I first saw the FlipFarm operation with my own eyes with you, I couldn't help but thinking that I was kind of witnessing one of those rare innovations that changes everything. It redefines the industry almost by itself. And it reminded me of other industrial breakthroughs that changed industries, like Henry Ford's automated car line with the moving assembly line. Or, there was the John Deere came up with the self-polishing steel plow that made it possible to, really do large-scale prairie plowing and prepping the land. And to me, FlipFarm looks like a similar leap forward, because what I see is with minimal human involvement, you've automated it so that you can grow huge quantity of oysters, process them on the water very quickly. And is there anything else out there that is even remotely similar?
Well, look, I guess not. And a large part of that is that I used to spend hours on the internet scouring, looking for some other options out there. And everything I saw was kind of similar. In fact, we had quite an efficient operation with the way we were running the bags. But fundamentally, we were still handling one piece of equipment numerous times every time we needed to do something with it. So I guess, that did make it very revolutionary. And it's kind of led to a lot of other changes in the way that we farm now. What we found, particularly with our guys on the water, is that they'll get one part of the system efficient with FlipFarm, and then they'll find a bottleneck somewhere else. And so that's led to other things that have been developed to try to reduce those bottlenecks right through the system. So it's a real change of thinking, and it takes a little while for that to happen when you're used to farming a certain way. So that's been one of the most fascinating changes, is just seeing how the mindset of people change once you're starting to really consider efficiency in an operation.
Do you find that you're making a lot of improvements and modifications on a regular basis?
We certainly have over the past 5 years, and it's starting to get to a point now where we're getting towards the end of that development. I mean, look, our learning curve was vertical. I mean, we were oyster farmers. We didn't know anything about plastic manufacture. We didn't know about globally exporting, freight, logistics, all this side of things. And of course, we launched the company in 2019, and along came COVID in 2020. So that kind of changed the environment for exporters, particularly in a country that's as remote as New Zealand or Australia. Everything we make has to be transported for long distances. So we were very focused on trying to reduce that freight cost. Our freight cost tripled during COVID.
Wow.
And so we were very aware as farmers that this is a big capital expense, and we wanted to minimize that as much as we could. So the early days, we were very focused on trying to minimize volume, and that led to some compromises in the equipment. But we've realized now that the little bit of extra in freight is more than paid for by having the components that last for 20 plus years and do the job that they're supposed to do. And now we're starting to look at onshoring our production. So rather than just in New Zealand and Australia, we're now looking at the US, and we're hoping to have everything manufactured in the US by the middle of 2026.
Part of the benefit of the whole floating farm concept is the wave energy and the natural tumbling of the oysters in the baskets, I would assume. What do you do with the system when big storms come along?
Yeah, that's been part of the reason that we're very focused on making sure that FlipFarm is used in the right location. It is a very robust floating system, but at the end of the day, it's 24/7 on the surface at the moment. So that means that we have to make sure that it is located in the right place and that the gear is built as strong as it possibly can be. At the end of the day, we're dealing with plastic components, and eventually they wear out. So we've redesigned that so that we can easily replace the parts that wear. But yeah, site location is very important. In saying that, we do get a lot of storms in our location. In fact, that's what started us on that journey, is making the equipment survive those storms. We live in an area called the Roaring Forties, which is the main wind tunnel around the bottom of the earth. So we do get a lot of wind, but the good thing about the Marlborough Sounds is it's not oceanic type conditions. So we are in largely sheltered bays, but they can still get pretty violent at times. So yeah, location is definitely a key consideration that we look at.
Where does FlipFarm work and where does it not work? Because it's not designed for every kind of oyster environment.
No. The nice thing about oysters is that there's no one perfect system for everywhere. We're trying to get FlipFarm to a point where it can be used in as many different environments and still works just fine. A lot of people think that FlipFarm is a deep water system, and that's correct. It works great in deep water, but in actual fact, our largest customer in New Zealand here, they farm on an intertidal mud flat, so very soft mud, and they have about 200,000 baskets that dry out twice a day on that mud, and that floats back up at high tide and works just fine. The key for intertidal is that if it's an area that's reasonably sheltered and the oysters are just sitting onto a mud or sand bottom, then it can work absolutely fine intertidally. Where it's not so good is where you've got a very high energy environment where those baskets are kind of being, you've got breaking waves onto a sandbank or something like that, because it is plastic, so it does get affected by that. We've got such a range of customers around the world now. It's quite fascinating to see where the system is used, everywhere from PEI, where they've got 4 foot of ice in the winter, through to places like the Middle East, where they've got 120-degree summers. So yeah, we're trying to get it to as wide a range as we possibly can, but the nice thing about oysters is there's no one perfect system that works everywhere. Sometimes you have to have a variety of systems to suit the location.
Yeah. So as you were developing this technology, how did you and Debbie divide the responsibilities, and who was responsible for what aspect of growing FlipFarm?
Yeah, no, it's been a really great and fun journey to do together. And Debbie's obviously come from a different background to myself. She's a big city girl, as she says, and she came from the corporate world. And I managed to convince her to move to a very small town in New Zealand, which was quite a shock. But she's a trooper. She stuck it out and raised 2 boys in a very small town. And we now moved to a slightly larger town. But yeah, so Debbie brings a very different kind of skill set to the company. Obviously, I'm a farmer by background, and so I'm the practical type Kiwi bloke, and largely the invention side has been my area. The growing and managing of the oysters has been my area. But Debbie, coming from a corporate background, has brought that kind of thinking now to our business, and that's been one of the biggest changes that we've had to make. Coming from a farmer to, I guess, an international exporter and manufacturer is quite a big jump. Taking on a range of staff is a big jump, and it's not something that I'm had a lot of experience with either. I'd worked in companies, but not in a staff management type role. So in the early days, I'd come home with these problems and ideas, and Debbie was a fantastic sounding board for that. And I probably confused her most of the time, but Now it's a little bit different that she's learned a lot alongside us. We've done it together, and now we can have discussions where she challenges my thinking, and I need that. And so a lot of the time I'll either be explaining something and get halfway through a sentence and hesitate and think, actually, I'm not sure that is the best way. Or I'll get a challenging question thrown at me that I have to be able to answer. And if I can't answer it, that's great, because I know that maybe it's not the right track. So yeah, we do work well together. Hey, any couple knows that working in a business closely together always has its challenges. You're much more honest with your partner than you are with other people in your business, but it works really well. To be honest, where I want to be is in the growing and the R&D and the development side. That's my happy space. I'll get dragged into the corporate side because as a director, it's inevitable that I am. But to be honest, I think it works really well when you can start to differentiate a little bit in tasks and try to stay in your lanes a little bit better. We've always been a very generalist. We started off with literally in the management team, it was Debbie and I, and we had the team on the water, and that's just grown from there. And now we've got much more specialized roles in product development and sales and that kind of area.
How large is your team today?
I think we're around about 40 all up. So
No
that's
kidding.
kind of, yeah, that was a surprise to me too. Never intended that to happen, but yeah, I guess it's an evolution. And yeah, we now have our own nursery as well. So we produce our own spat. We've got a great team there that look after that. We've got our own engineering firm that manufactures a lot of our machinery, and that's been great for our R&D side. And then we've got our oyster growing team on the water who get more and more oysters thrown at them and more gear every year, and they seem to just keep handling it. We've got a team of 9 on the water that are currently growing about 15 million oysters. It's a great team and a varied team. We've got a wide range of ages. We've had a lot of women working for us over the years, and that just makes a much more balanced team. So it's nice to be able to look for staff who can spend more time thinking about how to farm oysters rather than just absolutely grinding out that physical day-on-day work. There's still a place for the young, fit guys and girls here and there, but there's a place for everybody now. So we've got staff that have been with us a long time and they can evolve into jobs that are less physical. We're very remote in our farms, so it's around about 2 hours a day travel. We don't stay on the farm, and we're finding that guys aren't as physically and therefore mentally exhausted. It's one of the advantages that we can offer, that we go home every night. Other industries, they tend to stay out on vessels and things, so it's not quite as family friendly. So being able to go home every night, you get a break, and we work a 4-day week. So because it takes so long to get to the farm, we found it's more efficient to work a slightly longer day. And because it's not so physical, we can now do that. So the guys work a 12-hour day from when they leave home to when they return. About 4 hours of that's in travel. And at 4 on, 3 off works really well. It gives the guys that 1 day a week they can get things done if they need to. And we have a little bit of leeway with weather and what have you. We can shift the days around.
So it sounds like you've found a way to enhance work-life balance, which probably is better retention of your crew, right?
I really noticed the difference myself from when I was on the water constantly. You would get home physically exhausted and you don't want to think about the farm when you're at home. Now it's definitely different. It's just a much more pleasant job. I got asked, what is FlipFarm in a nutshell? And I said, it's just making oyster farming more fun. I enjoy oyster farming, but sometimes it's not as fun as it could be. But yeah, FlipFarm makes it more fun. That's a key for us.
So what does it take to adopt a FlipFarm system? It's got to be a big investment because you're talking about a lot of equipment.
Well, the first thing is that we invest quite a lot in learning about somebody's farming operation before we enter into that supply arrangement. And often those conversations end in, look, we don't think the system's right for you. We think there's actually a better system out there. And that's quite a frequent result at times. It is a big investment. The equipment is of similar cost to other advanced systems. It's really that machinery pack for the small farmer that does make it a little bit more difficult. But there's ways we're looking at mitigating that now, potentially with options such as lease. We do think also that there's an option in certain locations for a contractor or contract farmer that can
Right.
use the system to actually work with multiple farmers to supply those services.
Tell me a little bit about the scalability of this with respect to different farms that may not be able to invest in purchasing all of the equipment necessary.
Yeah, well, the scalability is a really interesting discussion, and we often talk about scaling farms, and I think it's quite a misquoted idea. Often people think of scaling as just increasing your size, and I look at true scalability as increasing your production without significantly increasing your effort or your cost. So I think the nice thing with the equipment is that because it can do so much in such a short time, you can do a lot with that set of machinery. So, for example, one of our operations, we have 50,000 baskets, and that 50,000 baskets is operated with that one set of machinery, that the same set that you might need for 5,000 baskets.
Mm-hmm.
So that does make it scalable. You invest once and it scales with you. But it also does offer up that opportunity for farmers to work together with that machinery.
I know that a lot of wineries, especially the smaller ones, will often lease equipment to do certain tasks, the bottling or labeling, some of those kinds of things. And they are companies that bring the equipment to the vineyard to do the tasks. Is that something that you guys are considering doing with smaller operations?
I do see opportunities for another industry here in the form of contracting. And coming from the farming background, you're absolutely right. As a small farm, you wouldn't necessarily own a combine harvester, or you wouldn't own a large hay baling operation. You would call in a contractor to do that work. So the potential to do that with FlipFarm, because you can empty, sort, and refill a lot of oysters, we can handle on a smaller size oysters several million a day. So it means that there's the option for a contractor that could potentially go from farm to farm doing that work. And that largely eliminates the need for a lot of that equipment, particularly in the sorting side, because a high-speed sorter is quite an expensive piece of equipment, and that's something that could be set up in a relocatable operation.
Are there certain kinds of oysters that perform better in a FlipFarm system than others?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. So one of the consistent things we see around the world is that it's growing a very good quality oyster. And I think surface systems are definitely the way of the future for that. There is that tumbling effect. The weather is doing the work for you. And if you get the right location and the right setup, it eliminates a lot of that work that's required to get a really good quality oyster. That was kind of the surprise for us. And I guess another one of those unintended benefits that we had when we changed to FlipFarm. Once we switched, we just got a much more consistent oyster and a much better quality meat oyster. And we've spent a bit of time trying to work out why that is. And we've done a few trials head to head. And I think it's a range of things, but the movement of the oyster seems to be a key. If oysters can move, it just does a lot of good things. And being able to reposition in the basket so that all the oysters get a fair chance at the water seems to be a key to it.
So basically what I'm seeing with FlipFarm is the ability to mass produce oysters on very large scale, huge quantities of oysters. Is the small farmer getting kind of squeezed out by big farms or what could be big flip farms? Kind of like what happened in the agricultural world.
Yeah. Like I could hear a cumulative shudder go down the back of oyster farmers when you talk about mass production.
Right.
I've come through the green shell mussel industry. Our industry now produces 100,000 tonne of mussels a year. And the great thing about oysters, and it's a little bit different to mussels, a mussel, if you get things right, they'll grow a bit faster and they might be in better meat condition, but they still pretty much look like a mussel. An oyster will give you feedback. An oyster will tell you when you're doing a good job and when you're not, and often quite quickly. A scientist friend of mine once said that oysters have a personality, which I kind of understood what he means once I started farming oysters. They express their natural shape, but they can be manipulated into the shape that you want as well. And that's the fun part. It's getting that right. And it's not always that easy. You have to learn the best techniques for doing that, and we're still learning that. So yes, we can mass produce, but there is a real niche there for the small farmer who has really great contact with his growing water, who understands his oyster, and who can use the benefits of the system to fine-tune that production and produce a unique product. And that's the thing I love about oysters too, is that you can have so many different branding from oysters, even sometimes quite close to each other, just because of there's different ways of growing them. And I think that's a real sales benefit, that we can actually have that visual difference from oyster company to company. So it's still a very hands-on process, even though it is larger production and you can do things quickly, you still have to manage it.
How many farms have adopted FlipFarm right now, and how many different countries?
So I think we're in about 16 countries and around about 300 operations
No kidding. So when you first started developing this, did you expect a global business, or was that sort of an aha moment saying, hey, we don't need to just do this here?
Yeah, well, it certainly wasn't initially, that's for sure. We developed the system for our own use. And I guess once we started to develop the system further, we realized we were onto something.
When you look to the future, what excites you and Debbie most about what's coming, what's next, where are you going to take this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's the problem-solving side of the business, and the problem-solving side of oyster farming is what really excites me. And there will always be things that crop up. And for me, I kind of enjoy that. So yeah, continuing to develop down the same path that we have with the efficiency, with that, there'll be new opportunities pop up with equipment and gear, and that's exciting. But I really enjoy visiting farmers around the world and seeing how they're using the system, talking to the guys on the water, because I can see it in their eyes. I've been there on the other side, and that excitement when you were able to create a great oyster and do it in a way that you can see is scalable. You can see that on their faces when we're talking about it. So that's one of the most enjoyable things for me, is traveling and visiting and seeing the system used around the world.
Well, Aaron, I want to thank you so much for your time and for sharing this with me, and of course also for taking me out when I was there. It's kind of a new revolutionary period in large-scale oyster growing, and I think that you are the cutting edge of it. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you, Kevin. No, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, that's it for this episode of Oyster-ology. Thanks so much to my guest, Aaron Pinnell of FlipFarm and Marlboro Oysters. What I love about his story is how something as humble as flipping an oyster basket can transform an entire industry. It reminds me of one of those moments in history when a single invention quietly redefined an entire industry, like Henry Ford's moving assembly line or John Deere's self-polishing plow. FlipFarm feels like that kind of leap, when a process built on muscle and repetition becomes smarter, safer, and much more efficient. It's more than just an improved oyster growing system. It's a transformational change in the oyster industry. Thanks so much for listening to Oyster-ology. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow me, rate it, and help share it with someone who still thinks you have to bust your butt to grow great oysters. And please leave a comment on what you thought about this episode. I listen to every one, and I would love your thoughts. And as a reminder from Aaron,
an oyster will tell you when you're doing a good job and when you're not.
Please be sure to join me again next time when we pry open the shell of another interesting oysterology topic.